So we sometimes hear, from an administrative level, concern about the cost of governance. What does that mean? Essentially, what it's about is the cost of doing everything it does, everything that is required to be done to sort of manage, say, the country, for example. Now, the cost of governance issues doesn't often come up with in Western countries just because there's just there's a level of management where there's no way that the amount of salaries that are being paid to these government officials are so big that it competes with um, other expenses or other sort of requirements of governance. But this can really be a problem at times in growing economies or poorer countries. Um, or lower income countries, however you want to phrase that, but it can be a problem sometimes because when you have a level of income that is going to government officials, for example, say for example the equivalent of what senators or House of Representative members are, that is a lot larger than what it should be, then it can cause a problem. For example, the way in which that can manifest could be say for example you have poor country A and and the senators or House of Representative members are making say $40,000 um, per month, for example. Now that's a lot of money. That's in dollars especially. That's a lot of money. And there's maybe if this was like say third world country in Africa, for example, they may not really be a lot to spend $40,000 on in that environment in that context. So it can be it can cause a lot of problems. First of all, it disincentivizes people from really focusing on maybe the environment they're in, because if they're making such a substantial amount that it disconnects them from the average person, or even the average wealthy-ish person in that community, even that it disconnects them from that. And also it's a substantial enough money where there's really nothing to spend it on in that environment. So maybe what it's really doing is creating odd incentives, like creating incentive for them to spend that amount of money like outside of the country more, because it just makes more sense. There's so much of it and there's really not a lot to do with it. So you're kind of working against growing the economy in that case. You're not really helping the country that do its best, because um, you're incentivizing these sort of officials to be doing so much more, to be spending their money outside of what would really benefit the country. So that's one reason why that can be a concern and that can be an issue. So what should we do about it? Say for example, one decides that it's completely ridiculous that um, in this poor country, poor environment, whatever, you have people in who are the equivalent of a senator or whatever that are making $40,000 a month. That when really nobody in that context makes that much. So even then, what can you do? Well, if that becomes an issue, if that becomes something you take into consideration, and there's an awareness that there has to be something done about it, because it's part of the problem. It's part of why there's not enough funds for other things. It's part of why these members of the citizenry are not as focused on growing the nation and growing the populace, because their attention is on, oh, okay, where can I spend this amount? And they end up spending a lot of it by traveling or just spending it out. So if that becomes something that the people become aware of, and the people start caring about and wanting to fix and wanting to curtail that, then what can they do? Well, one of the things they can do is really kind of try to trend that backwards. The same way you can have a minimum wage strategy of raising minimum wage. Say, for example, the one they have in California that um, where they raised the minimum wage from, say, I think it was 2016 to 2021, 22, whatever it is. What it is you rate by a certain percentage, a certain amount, $1, $2, or whatever each year, until just January of each year till you meet that. You can essentially do the reverse of that. You can do the reverse of that with the salary for for sort of governing members that you think that are too exorbitant, and is eating up funds, and it's maybe even eating up their focus. You can essentially do the same thing and kind of start to dial it back and say, okay, well, if it's at this level, then maybe it should start shrinking back every year, and say, um, as of the January of each year, it's going to go down or go back an amount, like say 5%, 10%, 20%, whatever the decision is, and just kind of start scaling it back. And the benefits of that is really that those funds will just be available for other purposes. And in an environment of poor country context, so to say, a little bit of money can go a long way. So if those funds are left available for other purposes, it can make a big difference. Um, and in a lot of instances, if this amount of if the sort of reduction or the sort of trying to scale that back a little bit applies to hundreds of people, well, that's a lot of funds that's being freed up every year that can be applied in other areas, and that can be a very, very helpful thing. Um, and can have a lot of beneficial effects. First of all, if that is scaled back a little bit, the incentive to spend more of it within the country will be greater as opposed to spending it out. And also, if it's scaled back a little bit, the incentive to just be more connected to the plight of those around them, that would be make more sense, because it would facilitate that as well. So there's benefits that can come with that, and why that will be helpful. So once the issue arises and that just sort of becomes a concern, then the next question is, if we want to do that, how can we do that? And yeah, what to the easiest way to do that, that is not sudden and abrupt, is to really just start to dial it back and become conscious of it. So any so the people who are going to be affected are aware of it, and they're aware of it ahead of time, and they're aware of it, that like for the next several years it's actually going to be dialed back. And what might happen is that some of these people might lose interest in that in that field or whatever, because maybe they got into it because it seemed lucrative to them on that end, but then they would get into other industries, or maybe, or I mean, whatever the case may be. But one benefit is that it might incentivize more people to want to get get involved in that area, who are in it for the right reasons, and who have the proper interest, and will have the proper focus once they're there. So that's one benefit that it creates. So once that's something that the people become aware of, and become sort of decide that that's something that they desire, is to make that that aspect of governing better, then they need to start working on ways in which to sort of dial back what the problem is, and scale it back in a way that more accurately, that's more suitable for the environment, for the context that is being governed. So those are some things to think about in terms of how to help that aspect of governing function better.